Pro-Ukrainian protests have taken place across the United States after Donald Trump and Vice President JD Vance's angry exchange with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Hundreds of people gathered in New York, Los Angeles and Boston, holding pro-Ukraine signs to express their support for the war-torn nation. This came after the US and Ukrainian leaders clashed in an extraordinary exchange before the world's media at the White House over the war with Russia. Zelensky saw the meeting as an opportunity to convince the White House not to side with Russia. However, Trump and Vice President JD Vance laid into Zelensky, saying he showed disrespect, driving US-Ukraine relations to a new low. Subsequently, the mineral deals which Zelensky had landed for was left unsigned and he was asked to leave. Later, Trump said Zelensky had overplayed his part and didn't want to talk about a ceasefire. On the other hand, Zelensky flew to meet with British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. The meeting was followed by a deal between the two countries. The UK has pledged over £2 billion in the form of a loan for Ukraine to make weapons. Joining us first to discuss this topic, we're joined by Professor Alexei Haran, who is a Professor of Comparative Politics at the University of Kyiv Molia, who's joining us from Kyiv. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. The first thing I want to look at is the fallout from this meeting that we've seen between Zelensky and Donald Trump. Of course, protests within the last 24 hours coming from the US, and there does seem to be unity from the EU. But what is the feeling from within inside Ukraine on this issue?
Well, the situation is not easy. Well, I believe actually that what happened in the White House, I think there was kind of problematic, the very preparation and organization of this meeting, because, you have the meeting with the press, public opening of this meeting, and usually it's ceremonial, so both sides are making just very general statements. There are photos from journalists, and then, people are coming, the leaders are coming for close discussion. It wasn't the case right now. So yes, it was emotional debates in the face of journalist cameras, and that was really bad. So now it's, there is I would say emotional tension between two leaders, and it's necessary to overcome, definitely. Well, Europe is trying to increase support to Ukraine, but definitely, American support is really important. So what we hope in Ukraine is that our ties with Europe continues, and actually there would be a meeting of Zelensky with King Charles III, but also in London, but also with European leaders today. And on March 6th, there would be a special summit of the European Union with participation of President Zelensky. So we hope that Europe demonstrates solidarity with Ukraine, but also that Europe will play kind of mediation role and will help to restore American-Ukrainian dialogue. We know that Prime Minister Starmer from the UK and President Macron, they know how to talk to Trump, so we hope very much for their support as well.
Professor Haran, staying with you, this conversation that we've had in the last 24 hours between Zelensky and Keir Starmer has led to over £2 billion worth of aid in the form of a loan for making weapons. Amid talks of work towards a ceasefire, is that something that you think is beneficial, given £2 billion worth of weapons will obviously be for part of any war? Do you think that sends a message to Russia and potentially to Donald Trump over in the States that Ukraine isn't ready for a ceasefire, which is a rhetoric which Trump has repeated throughout these negotiation periods?
First of all, let me explain about ceasefire. We are ready for ceasefire. Ukrainians want the ceasefire and peace more than any other nation in the world. But the problem is that Mr. Putin doesn't want ceasefire at all. He continues bombardment of the Ukraine. He continues offensive, he tries to continue offensive on the ground. And moreover, he said that more Ukrainian territories are to be occupied. So the question is about ceasefire, but on what conditions? So it's very important to clarify what are the conditions for this ceasefire. So it will not be viewed by Russia as an appeasement of aggressor. And we know that when you are appeasing aggressor, the situation may become very, very dangerous. So again, we are ready for ceasefire, but what kind of ceasefire? So in this situation, yes, the signing of a loan, almost 3 billion loan to Ukraine is very important because it's for buying actual military weapons, which we desperately need. What is interesting about this agreement is that the loan would be paid from the interest of Russian assets frozen in Europe. So Ukraine will not pay for that. We know that around 300 billions of Russian assets are frozen in Europe, and they are not confiscated, but they're frozen. But the interest from these assets would be used in order to cover, well, support to Ukraine and also revival of Ukraine, restoring the Ukraine.
Also joining us to discuss this evolving topic is Professor Madhav Nalapat, who is the editorial director of the Sunday Guardian. Professor Nalapat, thank you very much for your time. The stance we've seen with Europe and Ukraine is really a stark difference to the one that we've seen between Ukraine and President Trump and JD Vance. But we can't forget that at this moment in time, the EU are also trying to negotiate trade with the US as well. So do you think that there will be some personal interest involved in this coming from the EU nations when they're thinking about how to manage this situation? Keir Starmer, of course, was in Washington, had a conversation with Donald Trump that was positive. So is there a chance that he potentially looks at that and might be conflicted in what he decides to do moving forward, especially ahead of this conference that we have later?
Well, look, the Indian position has been set out by Prime Minister Modi as early as April 2022, which is that there needed to be an immediate cessation of hostilities and an immediate ceasefire. That Indian position has not changed. That remains the Indian position, that there needs to be an immediate cessation of hostilities and an immediate ceasefire. Don't forget, Prime Minister Modi made that statement in April 2022 in the presence of Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation. At that point in time, Russia had control of much less Ukrainian territory than it has now. And frankly, every month that goes by, Ukraine loses more lives and more territory. It's suffering terribly. I just want to point out that 2 billion may sound like a lot, but frankly, it's a flea bite. And when you look at the US component, when compared to the European component is overwhelmingly loans. The US component till today, I mean, we're not talking of post-Trump, pre-Trump, most of it was a grant, outright grant. And a lot of very sophisticated weapons were given to Ukraine. So I'm not very sure that the European countries by themselves will be able to shoulder either the financial burden or the defense burden, because quite frankly, Russia has made it clear that they have now taken over these territories. As per Russian law, an attack on these territories is an attack on Russia. So let's say there's an attack on these countries by France or the UK or whatever. It will be taken by Russia as an attack on Russia. And it's difficult to forget that Russia is, well, along with the United States, the preeminent nuclear power in the world. And according to the Russian law, it's perfectly justified in using nuclear weapons in any attack on Russian territory. So I think it's a complicated situation. Personally, I feel that what Donald Trump has said makes sense from the Ukrainian standpoint. Please end the fighting now, when there's still some chance of revival left. And frankly, as for the money that's now frozen of Russian assets, once you take that over, people from the Middle East people from Asia, people from all over the world are going to withdraw their assets from European banks. They won't feel safe in a European bank. Tomorrow, a European country can sanction any other country and take over the assets kept in a European bank. So I think that will be a very unfortunate thing to happen for the European banking system. And I don't think the Europeans will go that way. I mean, what Macron and Starmer and everything are saying in effect is, let's have a reconciliation. And the point is, if you have to have a reconciliation, there have to be a reconciliation on two sides. We had multiple peace conferences taking place in Europe, America, but where Russians were not invited. How do you have a peace conference without one of the belligerents not being invited? So, quite realistically, Trump's proposal is actually friendly to Ukraine, and this whole what happened was very unfortunate. I think President Zelensky was a bit emotional, and I think he sort of misjudged the fact that the Trump administration is an entirely different kind of administration from that of President Biden. And I think that misjudgment has been very unfortunate, especially for the Ukrainian people, because the people who have suffered the most since 2022 are the Ukrainian people.
Yes.
They've been going through hell, and they're still going through hell. And we, India, want that hell to stop. And we want it to stop now.
Yes, Professor Nalapat, very quickly, we don't have long left. I just want to look at the position that Trump is placing himself, but also the whole of the US on the geopolitical sort of table. Of course, there has been backlash from other leaders. The SNP are calling for Trump's state visit to be cancelled. We've seen action now within the US as well in support of Ukraine. Is Trump risking ostracising the US from these geopolitical meets and also ostracising them from being allies as they were before his administration?
Look, Europe cannot afford to be ostracized from the US, but the point is the US is now focused on the Indo-Pacific. It's no longer focused on the Atlantic as the primary theater. It is an important theater, but not the primary theater. The primary theater is the Indo-Pacific, and quite frankly, the adversary that the Trump administration is focused laser-like on is not Russia, which is compared to China, there's no comparison between China and Russia in terms of GDP, in terms of weapons, in terms of anything. So quite frankly, we think Donald Trump is right to focus on Asia, to focus on China, which is a huge problem in the Indo-Pacific, and it's going to be a problem for Europe as well. And frankly, whether the Europeans or Americans or South Americans or whatever, the Indo-Pacific is very, very important. As a trading partner, it's a very important trading partner. It's overtaking, Asia is overtaking every other continent in terms of bilateral trade with other continents. And Asia is growing very fast, unlike some other continents. So
yes.
In our view, the Ukraine war and the sanctions have had the worst effect possible on the European economy, especially on the German economy, because it's cut off access to cheap fuel. And frankly, the German economy is in deep trouble. And that's why politically, you're seeing these huge seismic shifts in the United States, in the UK, the Reform Party is on the move. In Germany, the AfD is on the move. Die Linke is on the move. And quite frankly, I think the European people, they are, I think, going to get fed up. And especially if they have to pay all the bills.
Yes, absolutely. Apologies, Professor Nalapat. I have to interject. We are unfortunately out of time. Thank you also to Professor